Kevin Yee. I'm serving at a Korean American church in the Valley, Church Every Day. And I've been there actually for 15 years. One place, one church. And I'm up here to talk a little bit about why and to try to convince you in terms of why you should stay for as long as you can, for as long as God calls you in youth ministry specifically. And I want to start by admitting that I'm a wreck sometimes, especially this past year. My life has just been completely overwhelmed, and for our New Year's Eve evening service, I actually shared with the students, and I apologized to them, and I said, I've been a pastor now for so long, and I should have this down, but I don't. And I've really messed up, and I've really failed you guys in a number of different ways. And I'm sharing this because in the midst of my failures, the thing that I've learned, the central truth that I've been able to come away with the last 15 years is in regards to what it means to live the cross-shaped life. That in the midst of suffering, in the midst of pain, in the midst of discouragement, I'm always reminded that when I'm weak, He is strong, right? Youth ministry actually isn't about youth. Youth ministry is about Jesus. And when we forget that, we actually lose sight of what's important. So I want to actually share with you some of the most important things that I've learned in my long tenure as a youth pastor, and why I think, again, you need to take the time to stay in youth ministry to allow the Lord to teach you these things as well. And so the first thing is I'm often quick to forget how slowly sanctification works, right? Youth students, youth parents, right? They want quick results. We serve a particular generation that's grown up with devices around the house where you can just shout stuff and things happen, right? They can just shout like, Alexa, how long is it going to take for me to be like Jesus, right? And we're like, how do you minister in that context? Because we get affected by the students that we're ministering to, right? They, as much as we're shaping them, they also shape us. And so one of the things I've learned over the long term is that we need a lot of time, and sanctification is a very, very, very slow process. And so the longer you stay in ministry, the longer you're that kind of pillar for students and parents who are looking for the quick result and looking for the quick thing. But if you've been trained in how to stick around long enough to be able to let them know, parents, everything's going to be okay, right? That you've seen a lot of these things. So they come in waves. Sure, Generation Z is different from the millennial generation before them, but there's still a lot of the same things that are going on. And if you can stick around and serve those generations, you get to be a rock that everyone gets to come to and ask, what do I do about these situations? And you've seen how these have played out in the long run. There's a wisdom and there's a growth that you don't know it right now, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, you will thank the Lord for as you begin to recognize how much God has used you in this context that you're particularly in. And it also helps you to recognize just how much more important the gospel is. The longer you stick around in youth ministry, the longer you see that you actually can't do very much. That really what it comes down to is an application of the gospel in the lives of our students. The second thing is that I'm often quick to rely on myself instead of turning to the Lord. 15 years in, that's still my number one temptation. When there's something that happens that breaks out, when there's a scandal, when there's drama, I immediately think, okay, how can I jump in and save the day? How can I utilize the things that I've learned to save the day? It's very often that my first response is to get on my knees and pray. But oftentimes that is the solution. Oftentimes that's the thing I need the most. Just this past last 2 weeks, I screwed up major. We had both a high school retreat and a junior high retreat that were planned back to back. Again, 15 years in, okay? And we were in a situation with our high school retreat where the high school retreat campsite, had no idea we were coming and doing our retreat there until 2 days before. How did that happen? That's a longer story I'll tell you later, but I'm just telling you. That stuff happens when I make too many assumptions about my ability to do things as opposed to getting on my knees and praying. And so, yes, we got on our knees and we prayed like crazy. Believe me, yeah. And so one of the big things that I've learned over the last 15 years is that I have to pray more as a pastor. I have to encourage my volunteers. I have to encourage my parents to pray more together. That is not something, when I was younger, that is not something that I did very often. It's a skill that you acquire as you move forward and as you actually recognize how weak and how frail you are. The third thing is I wrestle with feeling disposable. Youth ministry is a revolving door. And eventually, after some time, you'll feel this too. When students come back into town after they've gone to college, a little bit about what Pastor Bang was talking about, you wonder, when they come in and some of the students will say hi, some of the students will pretend like they don't know you. That's probably the most painful thing because I want them to catch me up on their life and they don't even say hi. And it makes you feel overlooked, makes you feel forgotten, especially if you wrote their college application, like recommendation, and then after that spring semester, it's forgotten about you. Like, man, I spent an hour and a half like thinking of creative words to say that you're hardworking. Right? Yeah. And the other thing too is like you feel humbled in those moments. Oftentimes I'm always talking to youth pastors about this, but how strange is this? Because I'm 37 years old. How strange is it that a 37-year-old guy cares so much about what a 7th grader thinks of him? Like that's a weird thing in youth ministry, right? Like, you wrestle with that. There's moments where you're like, am I supposed to care as much as I do? That's what it means to be a good pastor, right? But at the same time, you're like, dude, I'm over 30. I shouldn't care about what this middle schooler thinks about me, right? But you do, right? But I think in this, there's actually a very specific kind of grace. I tend to think of youth pastors as sort of two categories. There are those of us who are called to be more like Joshua, where we struggle through the desert with our students, and then we actually get to go into the promised land of college and youth, young adult, and so on and so forth, right? But then there's others of us that I think are called to be more like Moses, where we struggle, and then we die on a mountain. I'm serious. Right? I mean, think about how bitter Moses must have been, right? He was 80 years old when he was called to pull the Israelites out of Egypt. 80 years old, and then 120 when he dies, from 80 to 140. Do you know how many times he walked back and forth from the mountain to the people, from the mountain to the people, and then around and around and around in the desert? And there's no passages in any of the first Torah books about how appreciative the Israelites were of Moses. They were writing him encouraging notes, right? They were just complaining. Did you bring us out into the desert to die? Right? And Moses was like, no, your parents did. Your parents were the ones that... Shh, I didn't say that. But there's a special kind of grace in this. And I've actually decided to study the life of Moses this year as sort of my daily devotional, because as a longtime leader, I do struggle. And I struggle with a lot of the things that you're struggling with. So in some sense, the discouragement you feel sometimes, that's never going to leave. But I think that's part of what it means to be a pastor. But there's special grace in this. Because when Moses gets to the mountain, and he is told by God again in Deuteronomy 34, that he's not going to be able to cross over into the promised land, something really fascinating happens. So it says this in Deuteronomy 34. And the Lord said to him, Moses, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. And so this is what God tells Moses. Just as the Israelites are on the precipice of crossing over into the promised land, as Joshua is going to lead them over, God calls Moses up into the mountain and he basically says, look, I'm going to actually show you where the people are going to go. You're actually going to get a glimpse of the promised land. And so he gets to look out into the valley and he gets to see the land of the land of Canaan. And then it says in verse 5, something really curious. It says, so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day. And this is such a curious thing. What does verse 6 mean when it says, and he buried him? Who's the he? And when you read enough commentaries, you get a sense that people are trying to move away from this idea that the he is most likely God. And so Moses, at the very end of this journey, which by all accounts to some degree almost seems like a failure because the people that he came out of Egypt with, they actually all died in the wilderness. He's not taking any of them with them, right? Like he's just dying with those people. But at the very end, there's a sense in which what he gets to experience is so much different than what everyone else crossing over into the promised land gets to experience. And it's this intimacy with God that in the very last day, the very last breath that Moses takes is with God. And I think if you are thinking about your calling and why you entered into youth ministry to begin with, you can't tell me that the thing that you wanted most was to know God more. I mean, like maybe you got a call for youth ministry when you were 12 and you were watching a youth pastor or you went to some retreat and you cried and snot came out and all that stuff. And you're like, God, I'll do whatever you want. There's this thought comes in, be a youth pastor. And you're like, okay, I'll do that, right? And then you tell your parents like, no, you can't do that. And you have this battle. But the idea is ultimately in the end, I really feel like when you reach deep down inside and you try to remember what your calling is about, that it had something to do with I want to love God more. And I'm telling you, stay long time in youth ministry and you will begin to understand how God is slowly transforming you, how God is helping you to become more like him, how much God cares for you, how much God loves you. And that's the most important thing that I've learned over this time, is as a youth pastor, the students will come and go, parents will come and go, all sorts of volunteers will come and go. Some of the most painful things will come and go, but at the very end, if what you're left with is Jesus saying to you, well done, good and faithful servant, then it's worth it.